Max Verstappen did not just qualify 7th in Canada. That was the result. The real story was the car. After sprint qualifying, Max said the Red Bull did not feel good. He said it was difficult to be consistent. During SQ2, he also reported a lack of rear grip. That matters because Canada is not a track where a driver can hide an unstable car for long. Montreal asks for heavy braking, quick direction changes, curb riding, and clean traction out of slow corners. If the rear is not stable, the lap starts falling apart before the stopwatch explains why. So this was not only about Max being behind George Russell, it was about Max not having the confidence to attack the car the way he usually does. And that is where the result becomes more important than it first looks. Mercedes locked out the sprint front row with Russell and Antonelli. McLaren was ahead, Ferrari was ahead, Max was 7th. That order does not prove Red Bull is in crisis, but it does show how quickly a Red Bull weakness becomes visible when the rivals are close enough to punish it. The public version is simple. Max was P7. The more useful version is this. Red Bull had a car that Max could not fully trust in the first competitive session of the weekend. That is a very different problem. A driver can recover from one poor lap. A team can recover from one bad setup direction. But when Max talks about poor feeling, lack of rear grip, and inconsistent behavior, Red Bull has to treat it as more than frustration, because Max Verstappen does not need a perfect car to be fast. He has won races and fought for results in cars that moved around underneath him. He can live with pressure. He can live with a narrow gap. He can live with a balance that is not ideal, but he still needs the platform to respond. In Canada, that response was not there often enough. The first clue came before sprint qualifying. Canada was a sprint weekend, so Red Bull had only one practice session before the competitive running began. That already limited the amount of time to test setup changes, understand tire behavior, and check how the car handled the bumps and curbs. Then FP1 was disrupted by red flags that made the problem harder. Red Bull did not only need laps, they needed clean laps. They needed enough running to understand whether the issue was balance, tire temperature, ride height, or the way the car was reacting to the track surface. Instead, Mercedes looked more prepared. Antonelli led FP1, Russell was 2nd, Max was 5th. That was not the final story, but it was the first warning. Mercedes appeared to have a car that worked quickly. Red Bull still looked like it was searching. On a normal weekend, that might be less damaging. Teams can use Friday night to change direction and recover. But on a sprint weekend, uncertainty becomes public much faster. By SQ2, the warning became clearer. Max reported a lack of rear grip. That is a key detail at Montreal. Rear grip decides how early a driver can get back to throttle. It decides how much confidence he has on corner exit. It decides whether he can attack the lap or has to protect the car. If the rear is not there, the driver loses time in a way that is hard to recover. Max still got through SQ2, but the session already had a different feeling. This was no longer just about Mercedes being quick. It was about Red Bull not giving Max the rear stability he needed. Then SQ3 made the picture clear. Russell was 1st, Antonelli was 2nd. McLaren and Ferrari filled the places ahead of Max. Verstappen was 7th. Again, this does not prove a season-long problem. It does not prove Red Bull is lost. But it does show that when the RB22 is not in the right window, Max no longer has enough margin to cover everything. That is the important shift. Red Bull can still have pace in the car. The issue is whether that pace is usable, and the biggest confirmation came from the other Red Bull driver. Isaac Hadjar also complained about bouncing. That matters because it makes the issue harder to treat as only one driver missing the setup. One driver can have a preference, one driver can miss the tire window, one driver can have a messy lap. But when both Red Bull drivers talk about the car bouncing, the problem starts to look more like a shared limitation. This is where Canada becomes a real warning. Hadjar said that even when the grip was there, Red Bull could not use it properly. That is a serious line, because unusable grip is not the same as no grip. It means the car may have performance, but the platform is not stable enough for the driver to access it consistently. That is exactly the kind of issue that can make a team look stronger in data than it looks on track. The engineers may believe there is lap time available. The driver may feel small moments where the car works, but if the car bounces, lacks rear grip, or moves too much over the surface, the lap never becomes clean enough. That is why Verstappen Canada struggle matters more than it looks. The result was P7, the meaning was bigger. Red Bull had a car problem at a track that exposes car problems quickly. Mercedes looked ready. McLaren and Ferrari were in front. Max was explaining the car instead of attacking with it. That is not a scandal. It is not a transfer story. It is not proof that Red Bull is finished. It is a performance warning. And for Red Bull, the most important question after Canada is simple. Was this just one track exposing one weakness? Or was it the first clear sign that the RB22 still has a window too narrow for Max to rely on? This is where the pattern becomes clearer. Canada was not only one bad result. It showed what happens when Red Bull does not give Max a car he can lean on. Fans saw 7th place, Red Bull saw feedback from the driver. Max talked about poor feeling, difficult consistency, and lack of rear grip. Hadjar also pointed to bouncing. That matters because the issue was no longer only about one lap or one side of the garage. It looked like a shared limitation. That does not mean the RB22 is a bad car everywhere. It means the car may still be too sensitive in certain conditions. And Montreal is exactly the kind of place where sensitivity becomes costly. The track asks the driver to brake hard, ride curbs, change direction quickly, and get back to throttle cleanly. If the car moves too much over bumps, the driver has to wait. If the rear grip is not stable, the driver cannot attack corner exits. If the bouncing disturbs the inputs, the lap becomes harder to repeat. That is the real issue. Max was not just missing speed, he was missing confidence in the platform. And for a driver like Verstappen, confidence is not just emotion. It is performance. It decides how late he brakes. It decides how early he commits to throttle. It decides whether he can take the curb aggressively or has to protect the car. That is why the Hadjar detail matters. When another Red Bull driver talks about the same bouncing problem, the story moves from personal feeling to car behavior. One driver can prefer a different setup. Two drivers feeling the same ride issue is harder to ignore. This is not proof of a major crisis, but it is proof that Red Bull had a specific problem to solve in Canada, and the timing made it worse. Mercedes looked ready, Russell took sprint pole, Antonelli was beside him, McLaren and Ferrari were also ahead of Max, so Red Bull was not solving the problem in isolation. They were solving it while rivals had already turned their own performance into positions. That is where the pressure comes from, not from fake drama, from comparison. Same track, same sprint format, same limited practice. Mercedes looked more comfortable, Red Bull looked like it needed answers. That is enough to make the result matter. Because when the field is close, every weakness becomes public faster. A small bounce becomes a lost 10th, a rear grip issue becomes a compromised exit, a narrow setup window becomes 7th instead of fighting at the front. That is the pattern Canada revealed. The RB22 may have performance, but if Max cannot use that performance consistently, then the number in the data does not matter enough. The track decides, the stopwatch decides, and in Canada, the stopwatch said Red Bull was behind the group it wants to fight. This is where the story needs to be reframed. The main question is not whether Max had a bad session. Every driver has bad sessions. The question is whether Red Bull gave him a car that allowed him to respond. That is the difference between pace and usable pace. Pace is what the car might have. Usable pace is what the driver can extract when the tires, surface, bumps, curbs, and pressure all arrive at once. In Canada, Red Bull problem appeared to be usable pace. The car may have had more in it, but Max could not access enough of it when it mattered. That is why his comments after sprint qualifying were important. He did not just say the result was disappointing. He pointed to the feeling of the car. He pointed to consistency. He pointed to something Red Bull had to investigate. That language is careful, but it tells you the issue is not simple. A bad lap can be corrected. A poor car feeling has to be understood. That is the uncomfortable part for Red Bull. Max Verstappen can cover many weaknesses, but he cannot turn an unstable platform into a stable one by talent alone. He can drive around balance problems, he can take risk, he can find lap time where others cannot. But if the car is bouncing, if the rear grip is not reliable, and if the lap cannot be repeated cleanly, then even Max has to manage instead of attack. And once Max is managing, Red Bull loses one of its biggest advantages. That is the real meaning of Canada, not panic. Not collapse, not a transfer story, a simple performance warning. Red Bull does not only need more pace, it needs pace that Max can trust. Because when the car gives him confidence, he can make the result look better than the package. But when the car takes that confidence away, the package becomes visible. That is what happened in Canada. The weakness was not hidden by Max, it reached the timesheet. And once that happens, every rival ahead makes the problem harder to dismiss. Mercedes did not need to say anything dramatic. The front row did enough. McLaren and Ferrari being ahead added more pressure, and Max being 7th gave the whole weekend a different meaning. The result was not the full story, it was the symptom. The real question is whether Red Bull can make the RB22 predictable enough for Max to attack again. If Canada was track-specific, Red Bull can move on. If the same issue returns, then it becomes a pattern, and patterns around Max Verstappen never stay small for long. The proof is not one detail, it is the combination. Max was 7th, Mercedes was on the front row, McLaren and Ferrari were also ahead. That alone already made the result uncomfortable for Red Bull, but the result only became important because of what surrounded it. Max said the car did not feel good. He said it was difficult to be consistent. He reported a lack of rear grip. Hajar also spoke about bouncing. That gives the story a clear shape. This was not only a lap time problem, it was a car behavior problem. And car behavior matters because it decides how much performance a driver can actually use. At Montreal, that is especially important. The circuit asks for hard braking, curb riding, quick direction changes, and strong traction. If the car is bouncing, the driver loses precision. If the rear grip is unstable, the driver cannot commit early enough to throttle. If the platform is moving too much, the lap becomes defensive. That is why Max P7 matters. Not because 7th place proves Red Bull is in trouble everywhere, it does not. It matters because the weakness appeared in several places at once. The timing was bad because it was a sprint weekend. Red Bull had limited practice before the first competitive session. FP1 was disrupted. There was less time to understand the setup, less time to test changes, and less time to find a stable window. Then Mercedes looked ready immediately. Russell took sprint pole, Antonelli was beside him. Red Bull was still trying to understand why the car was not giving Max the feeling he needed. That contrast is the evidence. One team looked prepared, the other looked uncertain. And when the field is close, uncertainty becomes expensive very quickly. A small ride issue can become a lost 10th, a rear grip problem can become a compromised exit, a narrow setup window can become the difference between fighting at the front and starting behind 3 rival teams. This is why the Hajar detail matters so much. If only Max had complained, Red Bull could still frame it as a setup preference or a difficult lap. But when another Red Bull driver points to the same bouncing issue, it becomes harder to treat the problem as isolated. That does not make it a crisis, it makes it a real technical question. Can Red Bull make the RB22 stable enough for both drivers to use the grip that may already be in the car? That is the hidden part of the story. Sometimes the problem is not that a car has no pace. Sometimes the problem is that the pace is too hard to access. The data might suggest the car has more potential. The engineers might see areas where the lap time should come. The driver might feel grip in some corners. But if the car cannot repeat that feeling across a full lap, the performance stays theoretical. And Formula One does not reward theoretical performance, it rewards usable performance. That is what Red Bull needed in Canada: usable rear grip, usable stability, usable confidence. A car that lets Max attack instead of manage. That is the strongest proof that this session mattered more than the result. Max did not just lose places, he described why the car was not giving him the tools to fight for those places. The implication is not that Red Bull is finished, it is not that Max is leaving, it is not that Mercedes has already taken control of the season. The implication is simpler and more useful. Red Bull has to prove that Canada was a track-specific problem, not a wider pattern. If the issue disappears, then this becomes a contained weekend. A difficult sprint format, a disrupted practice session, a bumpy track exposing one weakness. Red Bull can understand it, correct it, and move on. But if the same symptoms return, the story changes. If the RB22 keeps bouncing when the surface gets difficult, Red Bull has a ride problem. If rear grip keeps disappearing when Max needs to attack, Red Bull has a confidence problem. If the car keeps showing performance in theory but not enough performance on track, Red Bull has a usability problem. That is the real concern, because Max Verstappen can cover a lot. He can cover a small balance issue, he can cover a narrow margin, he can cover pressure from rivals, he can find lap time where most drivers cannot, but he cannot fully cover a car that stops him from trusting the lap. And once Max cannot cover the weakness becomes visible to everyone. That is what happened in Canada. The timesheet showed 7th. The comments explained why. The other Red Bull confirmed the direction. The rivals made it costly, and that is why Red Bull has to respond quickly, not with panic, with clarity. They need to know whether the problem came from setup, tire window, ride height, track surface, or a deeper sensitivity in the car, because the answer decides how serious the weekend really was. If it was setup, the fix can come fast. If it was track specific, the damage is limited. But if the car only works in a narrow window, then every sprint weekend, every disrupted practice, every bumpy circuit, and every close qualifying session becomes more dangerous. That is where the pressure comes from. The rivals are close enough now that Red Bull cannot afford a car Max needs too much time to understand. Mercedes did not need to make a statement. The front row did it. McLaren and Ferrari being ahead added to it. Max being 7th made the weakness impossible to ignore. That is the future tension. Red Bull does not only need more speed, it needs speed Max can trust immediately, because when the car gives him confidence, he can turn a difficult weekend into damage limitation. But when the car takes that confidence away, the package becomes exposed. So the final question after Canada is not dramatic, it is practical. Was this one difficult track? Or was it a sign that the RB22 still has a window too narrow for Max to rely on? That is what Red Bull has to answer next. Watch the car, not just the result. Watch whether the bouncing returns. Watch whether Max talks about rear grip again. Watch whether he looks like he is attacking the lap or managing the car. Because Canada did not decide Red Bull season, but it did reveal the warning. The problem was not that Max suddenly lost speed. The problem was that Red Bull gave him a car that, in that session, did not let him use enough of it